society is so tense and waiting for failure of robots. You're in such a high stake environment. Failure has such a high cost.
And it slows down development.
It slows down development.
Yeah, like the team like definitely noticed that like once you go driverless, like we were driverless in Phoenix and you continue to iterate, your iteration pace slows down because your fear of regression forces so much more rigor that, obviously, you have to find a compromise on like, okay, well, how often do we release driverless builds? Because every time you release a driverless build, you have to go through this like validation process, which is very expensive and so forth. So it is interesting. It's like, it is this one of the hardest things. There's no other industry where like you wouldn't release products way, way quicker when you start to kind of provide even portions of the value that you provide. Healthcare maybe is the other one.
That's right.
But at the same time, right, like we've gotten there where you think of like surgery, right? Like you have surgery, there's always a risk, but like it's really, really bounded. You know that there's an accident rate when you go out and drive your car today, right? Like, and you know what the fatality rate in the US is per year. We're not banning driving because there was a car accident, but the bar for us is way higher and we hold ourselves very serious to it where you have to not only be better than a human, but you probably have to like at scale be far better than a human by a big margin. And you have to be able to like really, really thoughtfully explain all of the ways that we validate that becomes very comfortable for humans to understand, because a bunch of jargon that we use internally just doesn't compute. At the end of the day, we have to be able to explain to society, how do we quantify the risk and acknowledge that there is some non-zero risk, but it's far above a human, relative safety.
See, here's the thing. To push back a little bit and bring Cosmo back in the conversation, you said something quite brilliant at the beginning of this conversation that I think probably applies for autonomous driving, which is, there's this desire to make autonomous cars much safer than human-driven cars. But if you create a product that's really compelling and is able to explain both the leadership and the engineers and the product itself can communicate intent, then I think people may be able to be willing to put up with a thing that might be even riskier than humans, because they understand the value of taking risks. You mentioned the speed limit. Humans understand the value of going over the speed limit.
Yeah.
Humans understand the value of like going fast through a yellow light.
Yeah.
And when you're in Manhattan streets, pushing through crossing pedestrians, they understand that. I mean, this is a much more tense topic of discussion, so this is just me talking. So with Cosmo's case, there was something about the way this particular robot communicated, the energy it brought, the intent it was able to communicate to the humans, that you understood that of course it needs to have a camera.
Yeah.
Of course he needs to have this information. And in that same way, to me, of course a car needs to take risks. Of course there's going to be accidents. Mm-hmm. If you want a car that never has an accident, have a car that just doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
And so but that's tricky, because that's not a robotics problem.
And many accidents like are not even due to you, right? Obviously, right. So there's a big difference, though. That's not a personal decision. You're also impacting, obviously, kind of the rest of the road, and we're facilitating it, right? And so there's a higher kind of ethical and moral bar, which obviously then translates into, as a society and from a regulatory standpoint, kind of like what comes out of it, where it's hard for us to ever see this even being a debate, in the sense that like you have to be beyond reproach from a safety standpoint, because if you're wrong about this, you could set the entire field back a decade, right?
See, this is me speaking. I think if we look into the future, there will be, I personally believe, this is me speaking.
Yeah.
That there will be less and less focus on safety. It's still very, very high.
Yeah. Meaning like after autonomy is very common and accepted.
Yeah. But not so common that it's everywhere. But there has to be a transition, because I think for innovation, just like you were saying, to explore ideas, you have to take risks. And I think if autonomy in the near term is to become prevalent in society, I think people need to be more willing to understand the nature of risk, the value of risk. It's very difficult. You're right, of course, with driving, but that's the fascinating nature of it. It's a life and death situation that brings value to millions of people. So you have
Yeah.
to figure out what do we value about this world? How
Yeah.
much do we value? How deeply do we want to avoid hurting other humans?
That's right. And there is a point where, like, you can imagine a scenario where Waymo has a system that is, even when it's like kind of beyond a human relative safety, and provably statistically will save lives. There is a thoughtful navigation of that fact versus just kind of society readiness and
Yeah,
perception
accepting that.
and
Yeah.
education of society and regulators and everything else, where like it's multidimensional, and it's not a purely logical argument, but ironically, the logic can actually help with the emotions. And just like any technology, there's early adopters, and then there's kind of like a curve that happens after it.
And
But
eventually, celebrities, you get The Rock in a Waymo vehicle, and then everybody just comes
and then
along.
everybody calms down because The Rock likes it. Yeah. So,
If he posts
yeah.
him,
Yeah. And it's
yeah,
like, it's an open question on how this plays out. I mean, maybe we're pleasantly surprised and it just like people just realize that this is such a enabler of life and like efficiency and cost and everything that there's a pull. Like at some point, I actually fully believe that this will go from a thoughtful kind of, movement and tiptoeing and like kind of like a push to society realizes how wonderful of an enabler this could become, and it becomes more of a pull. And hard to know exactly how that'll play out, but at the end of the day, like both the goods transportation and the people transportation side of it has that property where it's not easy. There's a lot of open questions and challenges to navigate, and there's obviously the technical problems to solve as a kind of prerequisite. But they have such an opportunity that is on a scale that very few industries in the last 20, 30 years have even had a chance to tackle, that I maybe we're pleasantly surprised by how much that tipping point, like in a really short amount of time, actually turns into a societal pull to kind of embrace the benefits of this.
yeah, I hope so. It seems like in the recent few decades, there's been tipping points for technologies where, like overnight, things change.
Yeah,
It's from taxis to ride sharing services, all of that shift. I mean, there's just shift after shift after shift that requires digitization and technology. I hope we're pleasantly surprised in this.